Looks like we're live. Great. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning.
How are you?
I am awake
Okay, me
to a
too.
degree.
Me too. Um, I want to begin uh, uh, this morning's talk, discussion of chapter 15, by thanking everybody for being patient with us, those of you who have been following us uh, uh, throughout chapter 15. It's the longest chapter of the book as far as I can tell, certainly the longest chapter that I've been reading to this point. So I want to thank you for your patience. And then additionally, I want to apologize. I've just been so terribly busy over the last couple of weeks or so that I haven't been as assiduous. Is that the word? As committed as on top of things as far as responding to your comments and stuff. Um, and so I want to apologize for that. Um, it's not carelessness. It's really that I'm doing numerous things, and so that explains that. But believe me when I say that I am very appreciative for you, Matt, of course, and everybody else that's following us. Very, very appreciative for following along and giving me reason and rhyme to keep on reading this book. So we've been reading since the end of March or thereabouts, right? April, May, June, July, August, September, October. So 7 months complete. 7 months complete. Wonderful. Well, I've enjoyed every week. And enjoy the opportunities. Sorry, Matt, for such a long and and slow introduction. Are there any points that you'd like to talk about? Anything you'd like to mention before we get into the stuff of this week's reading? Anything that might have transpired over the weekend, or any update on your poetry and work and such?
Um, not really. I mean, just keeping. There's a lot I have going on, but I really can't really talk about yet because I need to get like more like approval. I need to, sign
Okay.
certain contracts and whatever. But there's a lot on the horizon. I don't know. Can we talk a little bit about what's going on or our presentation, or should we do that elsewhere?
I think we could talk about generally. Of course, we're going to be presenting um, at the fifth colloquium of the program for the study of Latinos in the United States, a program that is housed at Casa de las Americas in La Habana, Cuba. Of course, the organizers of the event, the organizers of the colloquium, the face of the organization of the colloquium are Antonio Aja, who is the director of this particular program, and Ana Nidia Albo, who is also intimately involved in the organization and the imagination of the event. We were there last year, as folks know, and it was a great event. It was a wonderful event. Um, Matt, you've got some things lined up for that uh, work that we're going to be doing. We're doing. Would you mind mentioning the names of the people with whom we're going to be presenting at the colloquium?
Here we're going to be there with Lupe Carazo Cardona, as well as Ramon. Ramon.
Raúl. Raúl.
Apologies, barely. Razor Raul. No, we're going to be there with
Yeah.
Lupe and Raul, and we're going to be presenting kind of on the work that she's doing with ethnic studies and the broader kind of ethnic studies movement here, and how and the role of art within that struggle, the ethnic
Yeah.
studies in the state of California, and also how the struggle for our ethnic studies is also trying to implement the kind of an education system that they have in Cuba. I mean, it's kind of education system
Yeah.
that that's very, very different from the one we have here. So
Yeah.
kind of the theme of the presentation, and we're very, very excited about it.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm honored and very pleased to be sharing a digital platform with each of you and to participate in relaying information about the historical developments to combat and contest and confront imperial mediocrity in the educational system. So anyways, so why don't we transition now that we've set the stage, Matt? Why don't we transition? You know, actually, since I've been reading, I'd like to focus. Hold on a second. I think.
A faint
Pardon?
harp in the background,
Yeah. I was listening to some music before we got on. Did I reduce it?
yes.
Okay, wonderful. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, it started getting.
Very soothing, but it was also
Yeah. Very soothing. Kind of puts me in the contemplative and analytical mode. But now is the stuff of intellectual action. So
yeah,
maybe
exactly.
Clash. You know, maybe we should have the Clash playing in the background or something like that.
Something,
You know?
yeah, I was getting kind of sleepy, to be honest.
Absolutely. Hey, anyway, I've been reading chapter 15, of course, and I'm caught by section 8 and its attention to some of the themes that we've been reading about over the course of chapter 15, and I'd like to conduct today's discussion around section 8
Okay.
of chapter 15. And I'd like to do so first by sharing a thought. I hope that the audience can think about and see things the way that I've been able to see as a consequence of reading this particular chapter and this particular section, and that is that where workers cooperate and where they do so in their class interest, they far exceed the mediocrity with which they are treated and obligated to reproduce when they operate in isolation and in the interest of the capitalist class. I think that the message is, for me, especially important over the last year, frankly, given the increased levels of isolation with which I've been obligated to operate, to employ, to work, to labor. And this opportunity to cooperate with you, Matt, and the opportunity to cooperate with folks out, with whom we are in discussion, is certainly the challenge that we are confronting. I'm sorry, the challenge that we are introducing to the year. So anyway, so that's my thinking about these things, and I'd like to contextualize and frame this discussion with that in mind. Okay. I'd like to say, as far as this work goes, that outlined here is the transitioning of relatively decentralized cottage industries to increasingly centralized factory industries, to factory manufacture, right? So this is the world in transformation that Marx interrogated, and to understand it, to illustrate it, and then to finally explain it as he does for us scientifically, he recurs to objective counts of the conditions of space and time, or rather the conditions in space and the conditions in time. He considers this transformation in relation to the production of what he terms wearing apparel. It's really interesting because uh, something as mundane, for instance, as the shirts on our backs, right, becomes the point of departure for him to uh, examine, the conditions, not just in the spaces of production and in the times of production, but he extrapolates and expands upon these concepts to understand um, the march of history and the greater concentration and the greater centralization of capital in time and space, by looking at such mundane and seemingly innocuous, uh, uh, almost irrelevant uh, sets of things. Before I proceed, Marx, I'm sorry, there it is. I called you Marx. I'll call you Mark as well, Matt.
Sure you will.
And I'll do so by accident, of course. Matt, what are your thoughts about this?
About Section 8?
Well, about Section 8, but really uh, Marx's attention to
Mm-hmm.
seemingly mundane things to make sophisticated and to provide sophisticated understandings about very abstract things such as time and space, so that this thing gives us an opportunity to understand time and space. I think it's really interesting. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I would agree that that's it's interesting. I mean, it's very interesting, like, because these are things that we often take for granted. Like, it's very, just kind of these are the mechanisms of the day, and they're not worth examination. And just kind of like, you're overthinking things, or you're staring into the
Mhm.
abyss, and the abyss is staring back into you, and you're
Yeah,
contemplating those kind of things. But the reality is that, like, um, it challenges your normalization. It challenges the things that you believe to be the way of things, that you believe
yeah,
to be the inherent, um, maybe not inherently morally right, but just it's not even question morality doesn't even come because it's just so inherent, it's so obvious. So
yeah,
these are the
yeah.
necessary things that one must do in the world, right? Um, and you think it's just kind of like you're moving through your day and you're just doing like what a man must do, or you're doing like
A
like
man's got to do what a man's got to do.
yeah, exactly. You're thinking a man's got to do what a man's got to do. And so, like, and then that's just kind of like, and a man's got to brush his teeth, and a man's got to eat breakfast, and he's got to,
Yeah,
get on
yeah,
the freeway, and he's got to whatever. But you don't think about, like, okay, well, there was a time before freeways, and there was a time before this compulsory demand, and there's a time before, like, the standardization of 8 a.m. as the beginning of the workday, or 9 a.m. as the beginning of the workday.
yeah,
And so, but you think that, like, it's only right that you should get up at 6 so you can be ready by 7,
yeah,
so you can be at work by 8, and
yeah,
if you're not doing that, you're just very irresponsible.
yeah,
It's very whatever. So these are the kind of, and then, and, like, and if you live 30 miles from where you work, it's no one's fault but your own, and da, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you think you get in this place now. But I mean, like, space and time, space and time and the demands of the economy, I mean, under shifting circumstances can get pretty funky. It can make you start really, really thinking things. Like right now, the question of space and time, I think, is getting people kind of weirded out because of the pandemic and
yeah,
these new technologies that we're using to communicate and not leave our home. People are starting to get used to they're starting to get used to this rhythm of space and time, right?
yeah, yeah,
And I think that to me, see, that to me is also the most interesting, and the only thing I really just, like, disagree with Marx. Like, it's not even like I disagree with him intellectually. I just the overemphasis on on the loss of certain things, like the loss of like, oh my God, like I can't believe that this way of life is dying, and there's the inherent charm and the defense of the inherent charm. Because right now he's talking about these mundane things and making us think about like what I would describe as like inherent charm. Um, the loss of these things. In this context, he's talking about things not that way. Things change and they simply change, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But he himself is subject to his own sentimentality about certain things. He gets very, very sentimental about these cobblers and these shoemakers, like buying these shoes. He gets really, really sentimental about the making of
Yeah.
shoes and like tailors and stuff. He gets really, really sentimental about that.
Yeah.
And I think people get very, very sentimental in general about the rhythm of their life. Um, but when the rhythm of their life changes, they tend to adjust. I mean, people are adjusting to Zoom life now. People are complaining about it. They're getting mad about it. They're like, the stress, you don't know the stress, you don't know the stress. But like slowly but slowly, they're starting to like just like okay, when things go back to normal, I don't want to leave my house as much. I do kind of like this, blah 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 blah. So they get standardized. I mean, the human person gets standardized by the rhythm of time and space. Um,
I want to.
as determined not by the individual, but as
Yeah.
determined by society. Now, the society can be shaped by um, all of us participants, and all of our voices have been heard, and society can be organized by like councils and groups and blah blah blah, and not set up for the exploitation of people and individuals. It can be set up. It does not necessarily have to be exploitive, but it will still have a time space, a relationship to time and space that exists beyond and above the individual, right? You're never just going to
Mm.
be able to do what you want when you want to do it. Where you
Yeah.
want to do it, that's never going to happen, and nor should it. Nor should it. The demands of an individual should never exceed the general good of the group. Now, obviously, like, what do you want to have for lunch today? That's obviously an individual decision. Like, what color should your toothbrush be? That's an individual decision. There's a lot of individual decisions, but like the general way in which you live your life cannot be outside the bounds of the general society and your contributions to it and your whatever. And it's not even a moral thing. It's just not possible. You know what I'm saying? You can't live inside and outside society at the same time. If you want to do that and just be like, I just do not want to be bound by the strictures of society and blah blah blah, and I just don't want to do things, and I don't value society, I don't value interaction with other human beings, I don't value being validated by other human beings, I don't value, or I don't want their criticism or their demand of me to do this or that or participate in this. Well, then go live in the woods. I mean, but if you're going to like live within society, you can't live outside of society at the same time. So it's what is society but the management of like our space in which is the limitations of where we're at. You know what I'm saying? Just think about this logically, right? So like you have like Southern California and the greater LA metro plus the Inland Empire and Orange County, right? And even stretches of San Diego, right? If you start heading too far east, right, outside the bounds of this kind of geographical area, on the way to Vegas, right, in between Vegas and here, there are stretches of places where there's a highway and there's people along this highway. But if you head like this way or this way off the highway, just driving off road, there's whole stretches of land where there's nobody, right? So that's outside society now. You're gone. I mean, like if the laws come after you, they got GPS now, so they can find you. But you head into the mountains and stuff like that. Now you're out. Now you're gone, right?
Yeah.
So there is this space where our human life takes place, and
Yeah.
within that, for you to be in it, there's certain like kind of like, okay, well, this time this happens, at that time this happens, at that time that happens, right? And that is exists society. And you say, well, no, like you're exaggerating. Am I? Like, go try and like go to Starbucks at 1 a.m. Like you can't, like you can't
Yeah.
do.
That organization of time and space is coordinated, of course, and Marx's lament, however sentimental it might be, that coordination is in the hands of capital,
Right.
right? And so by examining then the objectives of capital, which is, surplus value, he fits commodities, jackets, coats, cotton, wool, what have you. He fits commodities within various moments of history in order for us to understand, in order for us to see, for him to illustrate, and for us to see how the conditions in space and the conditions in time and the conditions of space and of time, right? How they figure in our lives generally, and the stuff of our exploitation. I was thinking about asking you something perhaps less historic and more poetic, right? In terms of Marx's work. I don't generally think about Marx, at least the sum total of this particular book, as poetic. I see it more as historic and economic, but there's certainly a lot of imagination and poetry in his work. And you, as a poet, I'm thinking about, now that I've become increasingly familiar with your poetry over the span of these last two publications, I see that in ways not unlike Marx himself, you focus our attention on some particular thing, whatever it might be, a mural on a wall, I don't know, a painting on a wall, etc. And you turn it upside down. And by turning it upside down, you give us an opportunity to see into the way of things, as you say. Give us an opportunity to see into the way of things, I would say, in ways that are not unlike the ways in which Marx allows us to see into the skeletal properties, the structures, the material bases of society. What goes into, and I'm not talking about the poetry that you write, I'm talking about imagination as poetry. What goes into that imagination? What goes into that capacity? What goes into that poetry?
Well, I mean, when I focus in on a painting or focusing on a mural or focusing on anything, it's kind of like it's my goal is to, oftentimes, like, and my goal is to take anyone on like a journey of feel, generally speaking. I want you to feel, if I'm gonna make you feel, I'm gonna feel happy, and then make you feel sad,
Uh,
and feel
uh,
happy, right? So that's just kind of like that's the artistic input that's already in the back of my mind that I'm gonna take you on this React journey, right? But the specific thing you're asking is I tend to zoom in, zoom out,
yeah,
and then zoom back in closer than it was before. And the purpose of that is to like zoom in because I want to show you what you're already looking at. I want to tell you what you already know, what you already feel about a
yeah,
certain thing. I want to get you caught up in the sentimentality that you've developed for an object because of the time and space you live in, right? And then I want to pull back and I want to show you this object in a kind of like economy or in a
yeah,
geography or an ecology even of its own, kind of place in time and space. I want to take you. I want to zoom in. This is what you're looking at, right? And you're looking at this wall, and you're familiar with this wall, and you're like this far from the wall, right? And you live
yeah,
your life this far from the wall. But in order to really understand this thing you're staring at, you've been staring at your whole life, and
yeah,
you feel you need to back up, 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 right? So you've been staring, let's say, that your entire life at a wristwatch, and you like know that it's a wristwatch, right? And you're like, that's a wristwatch. That's the time it is. That's where, and you think that's the world. You think the world is the time of day on this wristwatch, and you back up and you begin to see the wrist. You back up and you begin to see the hand. And you back up and you begin to see the arm. And you back up, now you see the person. And you back up and now you see other people. And now you back up and you see the street they're on. And now you back up and you see the street sign. Then you back up and then all of a sudden now you see the building. And you back up 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 further and further and further to place this wristwatch that you've been contemplating your entire life in the world in which it exists,
Yeah.
which you're not accustomed to doing.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's kind of what you're describing, what I try to do with that method. I try to like pull you back further and further and further. And for me, that was actually one of the things I really began to understand with Marxism was that, and it was not even so much with Marxism, but more with my own personal Marxist training. People that trained me were very, very against sentimentality about things. I mean, like they're probably too far in removing the human spirit until there was political unrest about certain things, and they got sentimental, and they exposed their own sentimentality, and that's how we ended up colliding. But anyways, but the whole point is that was like this I came up with this idea that like, okay, well, it's like staring at a wall and you're so close to it, you need to back up and 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 back up to further understand what you're even looking at. And so that was like, for me, that was like, okay, so, you know, at one level, there's like the immediate struggle that you're in, right? But like back up beyond that would be, okay, there's this immediate struggle. Then there's like a political struggle beyond that, right? So it's a political struggle for who's vying for power and who's like kind of like has the control of the state and who can command the state and what individuals are commanding the state and what interests do they represent, right? So like this giant sugar interest, for instance, is dominating the local economy. Okay, there's that. But then beyond that, I mean, so beyond the political was like these individuals, right? This political party, but beyond that, it's a giant sugar interest. So beyond the political was the economic, right? But beyond the economic was something even beyond the economic. See, and most people didn't go that far, which was technological, right? Which would make what even makes this thing possible, right? How could this even happen? Forget like who's doing it, and forget the evil that beats in the hearts of exploiters, right? Forget that. What's beyond that is like the variable is not that they have evil hearts. The variable is that that they seek to exploit. The seeking for exploitation is a constant. But the variable is the means they have to do it, and the means by which they do it, and the rhythm of the means by which they do it, right? Because not just the doing it, it's also the rhythm of it, and the rhythm of it is this time-space stuff. So that was technology. So it was like from the most immediate, it was like kind of like the individual kind of struggle, right? And then beyond the kind of social struggle, right? Beyond that was like political power. Beyond that was economic drive, and beyond the economic drive was the technological base to even do these things, the basis of that. And so that was kind of like how I began to understand things, how I kind of pull away from getting angry or getting upset or getting like really heated or even getting too bogged down in the details of anything. So I could see commonality, you know, in all kinds of different social struggles, right? So I began to see commonality with, let's say, the Mexican Revolution and the Russian Revolution, but not just these things that like I'd be in favor of, right? Like people fighting, but I can see commonality with the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, as well as the Meiji Restoration in Japan, as well as the rise of Otto von Bismarck, as well as the American Civil War, as well as all kinds of things. Where I see like a common factor here is the rise of the railway industries and the rise of industries on the basis of the railway, the basis of connecting a series of factory towns. Is the cause of all these things.
Are you saying that there is a grammar to imagination? It seems to me that if you have the capacity, or if there is a capacity, because of course it's a capacity that exists irrespective of the person. That is, if one has, or if the capacity to identify the shared patterns that exist across these various things that are taking place in the late 19th century, early 20th century, if one has the capacity to see these things, there ought to be a method. And by way of this method, by way of this grammar, one can then construct poetry. And so that on the surface, poetry seems to be so independent of grammar. On the surface, poetry seems to be so perhaps even whimsical, perhaps, you know, outside of the constraints of the existence of the person that is putting the poetry together. But when one brings uh, uh, conscious and objective understandings about the elements and arrives at shared patterns, one constructs a book.
Right.
One
And
constructs
so
a
and
book.
so so for most things, like, if you can like, for me, poetry is so like vague and ethereal, like, to put a definition on it. For me, I'll just say what I find good,
Yeah,
is when you can string together ideas or a story or something, that is both unexpected, but also logical. Also, it serves its own internal logic, even if the internal logic is
yeah,
not the logical world, right? It has an internal logic, and things happen, that feel, both like surprising but inevitable, right?
yeah,
Like it like the thing that happened, I didn't see coming, but I should have seen coming. I should have seen that coming. I should have known that's where I was headed. I didn't see it coming, but I should have known.
yeah,
And in that experience, what's really happening is that what you're doing is you're tapping in to, um, a connectivity which is not common. You're tapping into an uncommon connectivity. This is connected to this, connected to this, connected to this. So it's challenged. This, like, let's say that we are just accustomed to, like, just some number order. Seven
yeah,
five three. So just 753 dominates our life. 753, 753, 753, 753, 753, 753. And then all of a sudden you say, you know, 864. And you're like, oh my God, 864.
mm, mm,
864. You know? Jeez, I should have seen it coming, right? Well, the thing is that you're so used to this other pattern, right? And you in this other
yeah,
standardization. And so what you identify is the logic of the standardization, because your mind can't help but be standardized by the public.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's an infantile disorder to think that your mind exists outside of the society in which you were born.
yeah,
You need to get the fuck out of here. That's ridiculous. Like,
yeah,
and but that's how people think. But no, the reality is that you are. So your genius, the neurons in your brain, you know, that are firing off and doing things that no one has done before, and are making connections that no one has done before in that exact style, in that exact pattern, the exact thing that you're bringing new to the world. That's fantastic, but it takes place within a learned language. So obviously, it's not just objectively emerging out of you. Obviously, you're not just channeling the cosmos, whatever. I mean, even the word "the cosmos" is a word. It's a signifier.
yeah, yeah,
Language. It's something we've made up, right? So you can speak many languages, but you're still speaking in something. You're still speaking in a tradition. You're still a participant
yeah,
in something larger than yourself, right? And when you can embrace the fact that you're a participant within something larger than yourself, as opposed to like this individual like creation that they came here, they came down by lightning or something,
yeah,
then you can write better poetry, because then you can like tap in to this thing that you're a part of, and you can like begin to make patchwork that no one has made before, because you understand the quilt, because you understand the tapestry, because you understand the terrain, because you understand time and space, because you understand these things, and then you can begin to like connect things that are not traditionally connected. And when you do that, and it still fits within the rhythm and logic that people are accustomed to a certain degree, then all of a sudden you just blow their minds, and that's how you do it.
this discussion is reminding me increasingly of a couple things. Two films, as a matter of fact. I'm not, I like talking about movies, but uh, in fact, I wrote an article once about a movie. Uh, not outside the scope of the conversation we're having now, as a matter of fact. But anyway, this conversation is reminding me of a movie that came out in the 1980s, early 80s, I think it was, called Koyaanisqatsi. I don't know
Yeah.
if you see that movie. I want to I want to thank our good friend Mateo Latosa um, for introducing me to that movie, and then taking me down the rabbit hole way back when, when he introduced that movie to us. Of course, at the time, I didn't recognize, I didn't appreciate, I didn't fit the production, the artistic production, um, uh, in history, as it were. But as as we're having this conversation, I think about a particular scene in the movie where there is the production of sausages, the production of sausages, production of sausages, and the production is taking place within a technological system that is eerily similar, resembles in very uncomfortable ways the transportation of human beings through the subway systems. I believe subway systems in New York, right? So that there's this, on the surface, one has nothing to do with the other, but the camera is positioned, has, the director has positioned the camera in such a way that the distance of the camera from the object of attention is such that one can then see that the production of sausage for consumption is strangely similar to the production of workers en route to their consumption,
Right.
in whatever factory
Right.
they happen to be.
Absolutely. And so Koyaanisqatsi, I mean, the whole thing was, I mean, when talking about it, the director, can't remember his name right now, but he said that, um, you know, like in writing like a traditional story, it'd be like they live in the city and they do this and they do that and they fall in love, they come of age,
Yeah,
um, they come into conflict. There's a jewel heist or something like this, right? And the background of the story is incidental. And you say, but we're missing the fundamental story, and the fundamental story is the background. The fundamental story is the fact that our lives are completely disconnected from nature. And then he goes into some more, which I feel is fully sentimental, like because for me, you know the Empire State Building is part of nature.
yeah,
The Sky Needle is part of nature. The pyramids are part of nature. The things that we built are part of nature. We're so fucking arrogant to think that like we
we
somehow
are outside nature.
that we're
We're
outside nature. And the house you're in is a part of nature. Like we have augmented nature, but like is a beaver's dam outside of nature?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, you know what I'm saying? Like a bear cave, that I'm sure that they augmented in some kind of way so that they can live. Is that outside of nature? You know?
sure.
I mean, like no. I mean, obviously there's a far greater level of complexity to things that we do than that of I don't know. I mean, the beaver dam seems actually pretty complex, but there's or a honeycomb. I mean, like, is a honeycomb outside of nature? Because a
Oh
honeycomb
man,
is constructed. Is an anthill outside of
yeah,
nature? Because an anthill is also constructed, right? And
yeah,
an anthill is constructed out of natural resource, being the
yeah,
dirt, right? So like what's different about it is obviously it's geared towards exploitation. It's geared towards this highly complex form of exploitation that's dependent upon a series of factors. I mean that's different, right? But I'm not saying it's not, but like it's not outside nature. Like the atom bomb is not outside nature. Like nothing we do is outside nature because we are in nature. We are nature. We are not out of nature. We are part of the natural world. So I think
yeah,
that's where I kind of disagree with him a little bit. But I mean, the what he accomplished in that film is quite stirring. I mean, like the fact that like if you mentioned the sausage thing. I mean, but again, he's employing the technique I was talking about earlier, which is to like take you back up, back up, back up, back up, back up, and like you're in the city, you're like, oh, I know that. That's rush hour, and then all of a sudden it's moving away from rush hour. Now you can see the whole city. Now you can see like all kinds of things going on, and it's very unsettling, right? Because you're looking at what you thought was a traffic jam, and you're expecting something to happen within the traffic jam that's familiar to you about traffic jams, and he's pulling you away. So what he's doing is essentially almost like an anthropological study on like, you know, the world you live in. So you are now the subject of an anthropological study, and you don't like it because nobody likes that. But like, so but it's very unsettling, and it's just like, oh my god, like
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
is a force that is pushing me to do the things that I do that exist beyond my own small conception of a man's got to do what a man's got to do. A man's got to do what a man's got to do because a society that's more powerful than he or she or whoever is demanding that they do it. It's not coming from within you. It's coming from outside of you,
Yeah.
and that's a terrifying realization that most people don't want to contend with. They want to actually think that they are the authors of their own lives, and none of us are. No, none of us are the authors of our own lives under these conditions. We are, um, you know, if we can manage to eke out a life that we're happy about, that's a miracle, you know. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
uh, we're still not free.
Yeah.
We're still bound by the constructions of living in a society set up for exploitation.
Well, to bring us back to the book,
Yeah,
yeah, to bring us back to the book, because you know, first off, of course, before we get into the stuff here, uh, none of the stuff that is here none of the text that is here in this book is possible without considering the sort of discussion and the ideas that we're considering at this particular moment in terms of one's position uh, in space and one's position in time, and then of course the subsequent uh, inclinations, the subsequent epistemologies that surface as a consequence of this ontological condition, to use these fancy, philosophical terms. And so it's important. It's important that we consider these things. It's important that we consider the patterns that exist across seemingly different things. And it's important to understand how these patterns, uh, misrecognized as they are, have a penetrating capacity in our consciousness. And so, uh, with that in mind, with this understanding in mind, uh, I'd like to say, and to follow up on something that I had said earlier, that this book also reminds me of another movie released around the same time that Koyaanisqatsi is released, and this movie happens to be El Norte, by Gregory Nava. It is, in Marx's attention then to something as mundane as a shirt on one's back and its production, that he, in this chapter, what he does in this chapter is he examines those things that transpire in the span of time, and that those things that transpire in the span of time, and those things that transpire in the span of space. And he gives us an opportunity also to see that those patterns, those things that were taking place during the moments of nascent capitalism, reproduce themselves across time and across space, fictitious and artificial as the categories of time and space invariably are. Those patterns reproduce themselves 300 years later in 19th century urban England. Um, and so the movie that I'm thinking about now is useful to think about the things that he's talking about in this particular chapter, because of course he's talking about the displacement of rural inhabitants, a violent attack on rural existence, their displacement, their subsequent containment in filth and disease, their hyper exploitation now or then in 19th century England, right? As factory workers in the textile mills and the clothing manufacturing centers of England, in ways that, as I was reading this particular chapter, I was thinking about the movie. I was thinking about the fact that 100 years later, or 130 years later, after the book, or after the book was written, or so, 120 years after the book was written, in the 1980s, the same sort of things are taking place. And now, of course, it's the city of LA, it's Southern California, that is a wearing apparel capital hub of the late 20th century. And those conditions, those patterns reproduce themselves in ways that are not unlike the things that were taking place in 19th century England, and for that matter, in ways that are not terribly unlike the things that were taking place in 16th century and 17th century Germany, 16th century and 17th century England, or the British Isles of the time. I'd like to turn our attention for a moment to two quotes in the reading that give us opportunity to see what Marx is addressing here. In this case, he's talking about the production of wearing apparel, right? It is carried on partly in manufactories in whose workrooms there is but a reproduction of that division of labor, the membra disjecta of which were found ready to hand, partly by small master handicraftsmen. These, however, do not, as formerly, work for individual consumers, but for the manufacturers and the warehouses, and to such an extent that often whole towns and stretches of country carry on certain branches, such as shoemaking as a specialty, right? Finally, on a very great scale, by the so-called domestic workers, who form an external department of the manufactories, warehouses, and even the workshops of the small masters. And then he concludes in this particular paragraph with this analysis. At last, the critical point was reached. The basis of the old method, sheer brutality in the exploitation of the work people. Think about the torture and the assassination of towns in Central America and Guatemala, as far as movies is concerned, right? Yeah. Exploitation of the work people. And then, just to finish, accompanied more or less by a systematic division of labor, no longer sufficed for the extending markets and for the still more rapidly extending competition of the capitalists. The hour struck for the advent of machinery, the decisively revolutionary machine, the machine which attacks in an equal degree the whole of the numberless branches of this sphere of production: dressmaking, tailoring, shoemaking, sew-making, hat-making, and many others, is the sewing machine. I'm thinking about that scene in the movie El Norte where Rosa is making clothes, the clothes on our back. Matt, what are your thoughts? What do you think?
Well, I mean, in the same chapter, I mean, just so people get, I don't want to go from where you were talking, but in chapter 4, I mean, in chapter 8, he talks about 4-year-olds being in the factories, like 4 and 6-year-olds being in the factory, just so people get an idea of how brutal.
Some footnotes I read 2 years old.
Huh?
In some footnotes of this chapter, I've read that kids as young as 2 years old were already working. Wow. It's terrible.
Yeah, it was really horrific things he was writing about. So, and when I read that, and I also reading what you were talking about the division of labor and how like certain labor is segmented certain people, I really thought it was really. I mean, it really the thing I think I came up with in my mind was that he was describing a world wherein kind of the standards and practices and even law of certain like labor rights that are won through like political struggle don't apply. They simply do not apply. And of course, when I think of that in the United States, I always think of agricultural labor, right?
Yeah.
And agricultural labor have all these like laws against like child labor, against like OSHA standards, all kinds of things, simply do not apply. And so it's really just and like and who are you going to get to do that work? You're not going to get uh, the people who make up the bulk of like the working class, so to speak, that could organize whatever. You're going to get people who cannot organize for one reason or another, right? And and in England, in manufacturing England at the time, that was children. That was women, but even more more defenseless are literal
Yeah.
children, right?
Yeah.
And so like that was what Marx was describing. So it's really important that we don't like just in the large thing he's talking about here, and then moving to something else to not lose the brutality of what he was describing. So when you talk about El Norte, though, that takes my mind somewhere else. Now, that takes my mind to is that they have these visions of coming to El Norte, these visions of coming to the United States and it being a certain kind of way, and the things that they're promised to have to be here in the United States. And I always think that in the beginning of the film, we're looking at them by the river, and they're like washing their clothes, and they're washing their blankets, and they're doing something with these blankets or something. And
Mm-hmm.
the blankets are just the most vivid, beautiful colors made in Guatemala. Just the most vivid, beautiful, just the dyes are so rich and they're so just like so
Yeah.
good. And then you come to America, the wealthiest nation on earth, and these places they want to be, and everyone dressed like shit. I mean, even people who are like wearing suits and like nice stuff, like it's always like with a tie, like hanging off like that. They're just dressed like shit by way of comparison. Like everything in the United States looks like shit by way of comparison. It's all
Yeah.
mass produced. And then she goes to this washing machine. She can't figure out how it works. It's so complicated, so needlessly complicated with all these different buttons. It's just it's a harrowing experience to try and work in this woman's house and figure out all these machines. Um, but like it really disconnects you. I mean, maybe I'm getting sentimental, but people are so disconnected from the processes by which things are made and
Yeah.
by what they're
Yeah.
doing. And so in Guatemala, there's elements of society that are very very it's better,
Are you getting sentimental? Are you getting
I
sentimental
am
on TV?
probably it's just better, right? Because it's better, but
Yeah.
they're not mass consumed. They're not mass produced.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but then of course there's the also it also shows you the place that Guatemala has within within the global economy,
Yeah.
which is soil and labor that can be produced for the American kitchen. Like we're talking about bananas here, right? And so like we're talking about we're talking about food, just talking about food stuff, and we're talking about the work that is required to get that food stuff, right? And so we see very early that the people who are interested in getting these commodities and getting this food and turning this food into commodity, turning this picked banana into a commodity, are willing to kill. They're willing to commit murder in order to maintain the way of things. So people run, and
Genocide.
they run to the place where the destination of those bananas. They run to the destination of that food stuff. So like this process that we see in Guatemala is the same process we see in El Salvador, same process we see in Honduras, same process we see in Thailand, same process we see all over the world, right? Of of um, of, of, of an imperial economy
Is is
disrupting
is
disrupting.
it?
Now, see, like see the way that the colonialism imperialism works is that there's an economy which because everyone if there's more than like 30 people standing around they have an economy, right?
Yeah.
So what it does is it interrupts your economy, the economy that you have, and it pulls it into the imperial economy to have it
Yeah.
designated. So it's not like just a division. You get pulled into this division labor. You get pulled into this market. You get pulled into this thing. And that role of colonization, it's usually extractive labor, and it's horrific. And there's also like capital penetration, which means that like the money's gonna go in there, and they're gonna create a market on top of that, and so all kinds of things that happen. So it creates a system where it's pulling. It's not just pulling the bananas off the tree. It's also pulling the labor from the people, and it's also pulling everything out of the ground. And eventually, it pulls the people out of the country into the imperial capital. And then once they arrive there,
And people are en route to the stations of their consumption.
mhm,
And so if they were consumed, if they were, if their labor is consumed, and if their labor ends up on somebody's kitchen table,
mhm,
uh, and it's consumed there at the kitchen table, there as the banana is, there as the banana is placed on a kitchen table, uh, that consumption is their destination, right? So they're going to where they are being consumed. Does that make sense? They're
absolutely
they're on they're on route to their subsequent
right.
and continual consumption.
But see, here's
And
the thing. So people ask this question though all the time, like, well if capitalism, if U.S. capital is dependent upon migrant labor, why does it treat them so, right? Well, why would you deport these? Why would you deport people or have them live in the fear of deportation if they are bringing cheap labor? Why would you do that? Well, the reality is that you do that to keep that labor cheap. The reason labor is cheap is because it is labor under duress. It is labor. It is precarious labor, and by keeping labor precarious, you keep labor cheap. So having an entire designation of a workforce within the workforce that is precarious, that has no rights, that is criminalized, to have an entire section of the labor force that is considered criminal, right, is a way to keep that labor cheap,
yeah,
right? And so similarly, in England, you're talking about like, working children,
yeah,
like you have a way of keeping the labor force, keeping that section of production cheap. And so that is what, the agricultural companies do in this country. That is what the meat packing industries do in this country. That is what all these positions of labor, which are dangerous, which where human life is not protected, where your health is not protected, where the conditions of your labor are not necessarily safe. Like I don't mean like safe in like a postmodern way. I mean like quite literally not physically
yeah,
safe.
yeah,
Um, are given to are typically staffed by individuals who, for one reason or another, in this country, it's largely, especially being documented, are precarious. And so that is kind of, I mean, that's the way of capital. Is to create the conditions by which certain labor can be precarious and therefore exploited.
yeah. Well, there's a second half of this discussion that I'd like, that we've run out of time to address, but it has to do with cooperation, right? It has to do with cooperation. Hopefully, I can. Hopefully, we have the opportunity to talk about cooperation as an element um, in the construction of the conditions of time and space, as we close up and lead towards the closing chapter. I'm sorry, lead towards the closing pages of this particular chapter next week. Um, Matt, you've addressed precarity, the precarity of labor. You've addressed um, the um, the role of precarity in facilitating hyper exploitation, and of course, we've talked about the exploitation of garment workers in the 19th century. We've talked about the exploitation of garment workers in the 20th century on the other side of the globe, though under similar patterns. Um, would you like to select a poem?
Sure, sure.
Uh,
Well, you mentioned Koyan Koskotsky, and I remember when I was completing sitting on the second floor, I was kind of under the gun, so I like needed like just like grab patterns from different places, right? So I was like, okay, I know what the idea is, but I need a pattern to execute this. And so one of the things I did was actually watch Koyaanisqatsi, and this is what I came up with,
Oh,
having watched Koyaanisqatsi. It's called Everything in Between. Gas station, supermarket, food court, coffee shop, bus stop, burrito supreme. Smokestacks, minivans, jumbo tanks, border fence, tax shelters, nuclear debris, penny stocks, trust funds, checkpoints, bailouts, offshore accounts, broken windows, overdraft fees, gold, coal, oil, silver, satellites, islands of plastic, burning river pipelines, food desert, landmine, fracking, quake, the carcinogenic republic of acid rain, foggy bottom, the World Bank, the dying forest, the falling trees, the sky depleted with the rising sea as the horizon greets the next mass extinction. And that's what I got from Koyaanisqatsi.
all right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. Garay, thank you for chiming in. San, thank you for chiming in. Dust, as always, thank you so much for chiming in. Very busy this week. We're getting ready for that conference presentation. And so that we're coordinating some very neat and interesting people. And hopefully we can put a wedge in conventional framings of time and space by way of our work and our cooperation, Matt. I look forward to next week. Thank you all for joining us.